In this episode, we are going to see a couple of interesting things about Python object-oriented programming. We are going to understand how we can maintain our data outside of our Python code, meaning in a structured file like a CSV file. And we're also going to understand what are static methods and what are class methods. Now, a lot of people think that those are pretty much the same, but there are some key differences between a class method to a static method. So that is going to be very interesting to watch, and there is a lot to learn from this episode. So with that being said, let's get started. Alright, so until this point, we understood how we can change the way that we represent our objects, and we also understood how we can access to all of our instances by this class attribute that we intentionally named all. Now in this part, we are going to take a look to solve one more problem that we have in terms of best practices when we are going to extend this application and add more features. Now you can see that until this point, we maintain our data as code in this main.py file by only instantiating those 5 items. Now when we will look to extend this application and add some more features, then we might have a harder life to add those features because the actual data and the code are maintained in the same location, meaning in the same main.py file. Now you could have think about creating a database that will maintain this information, but I want to keep things more simple for the purposes of this tutorial, and that is why I'm going to use something that is called CSV that you might have heard of. CSV stands for comma separated values, so this means that you could go ahead and use a CSV file and you could store your values as comma separated, where each line will represent a single structured data. And CSV is a great option here because it allows the data to be saved in a table structured format. Alright, so let's go ahead and create a CSV file, and I will actually go ahead and name this items.csv like that. And I will go ahead and paste in some CSV content that will be responsible at the end of the day represent the same data that we look to have here. So you can see that at the first line, I have name, price, and quantity, and you can see that those are comma separated. So those represents the columns that we are going to have as the data that we are going to maintain, and in the second line and further, we are going to have some data that will represent the actual data that we look to maintain. So if we were to now split the panes, then you can see that those are quite equivalent, and now we should only look for a way to read this CSV file and actually instantiate those objects. Now you can see that I have a suggestion by PyCharm to install a plugin that will support CSV files. So I'm going to just click on that and install those plugins. And you can see that I will have a CSV reader here, and we will see if we will be able to see this data in a table, which will be a lot nicer. So let's go ahead and install this. And now you can see that I have some more options that I can actually go ahead and use from here. I know that this is quite small, but actually you have some tabs that you can go ahead and click on them. And if I was to click on table editor and actually give this file more focus, then you can see that I actually have the best way to read this data now. You can see that I have my columns, you can see that I have my rows, and that is quite nice. Now I can really go ahead and visualize my data more nicer, and it is just more common way to maintain your data. Okay, so now that we understood how CSV files are working, let's go ahead and read our CSV files and instantiate the instances in a generic way. So it makes sense to delete those 5 lines, and I'm going to use those lines below the apply discount and use a method that I could name instantiate from CSV like that. Now you can see that this one is also going to receive self, because if you remember, I said that in each method that we will design, we need to receive at least one parameter that will be passed as the instance itself, because this is how Python OOP works. Now the problem is we are not going to have any instances on our hand to call this method from the instance, because this method is actually designed for instantiating the object itself. So this means that this method could not be called from an instance. So the way that this is going to be solved is by converting this method into a class method. Now, a class method is a method that could be accessed in the following way. So I will use this line to delete that, and it could be accessed from the class level only. So this will look like item dot instantiate from CSV, and then in here we will probably pass our CSV file. So this method should take full responsibility to instantiate those objects for us. So now that we understood this, let's go ahead and see how we can create a class method. So for sure we need to delete the self, and I know that we have errors, but we are going to solve each one of those just in a second. Now, in order to convert this to a class method, we need to use a decorator that will be responsible to convert this method into a class method. Now, decorators in Python is just a quick way to change the behavior of the functions that we will write by basically calling them just before the line that we create our function. So we could use the @ sign and use the class method in here, and then this instantiate from CSV method will be a class method. Alright, so now that we understood this, then we should also understand one more piece of information before we go ahead and design this method. Now I want to show you what will happen if I was to delete the entire name and try to recreate this function here. And I will just say instantiate from CSV again. Now pay attention what will happen if I was to open up and close the parentheses. Now you can see that it still receives a parameter, but this time it is named CLS. Now what is going on here? And the thing that is going on here is the fact that when we call our class methods, then the class object itself is passed as a first argument, always in the background. So it is a bit like the instance where it is also passed as a first argument, but this time when we call a class method in this approach, then the class reference must be passed as a first argument. So that is why you should still receive at least one parameter, but we probably understand that we could not name this self because that is just going to be too much confusing. Okay, so now let's go ahead and write some code to read the CSV file and instantiate some objects. Now I'm going to go up top first, and I'm going to import a library that is called CSV. So I will go here and I will use an import CSV line, because that will be the library that will take full responsibility to read the CSV file, and then we will see how we can instantiate some objects. Alright, so now I can go ahead and use a context manager to read the items.csv file. Now both of those files are located in the same location, so I can just directly say with open items.csv, and the permission that I will be passing here could be R because we only look to read this, and I will say as f like that. Now inside this open, I will go ahead and use some method to directly read this CSV, which at the end of the day will be responsible to convert this into a Python dictionary. So I will say reader is equal to csv.dict reader, like that, and I will pass in the content of our file like that. Now this method should go ahead and read our content as a list of dictionaries, but at the end of the day we should also go ahead and convert this into a list. So I will go ahead and create one more variable that will be equal to items, and I will just convert the reader into a list, and that's it. And now that we have completed the actions that we wanted to complete by reading this CSV file, let's go ahead and use a shift tab to indent out. And now before we go ahead and instantiate some objects, let's go ahead and see the results of iterating over the items list. Now I will go ahead and use for item in items, and then I will just use print items to show you the behavior of that. And excuse me, it should be item. Alright, so now that we understood this, then let's go ahead and see what we have in those lines. So after our class definition, we only go ahead and call this item.instantiate from CSV method. So if I was to run that, then you can see that I receive some dictionaries in separated lines, and that is because I iterate over a list of dictionaries in here, and that is just perfect. Alright, so the only thing that we miss right now is creating instances. Now, besides printing those, then we could now say something like item and open up and close parentheses, and this should be enough to instantiate our instances. Now, I can go ahead and pass my arguments in here by basically reading the keys from a dictionary. So I can say name is equal to item.get, and that will receive name, and now I can add a comma and duplicate this line twice and change those accordingly. So this will be price and this will be quantity, and now I need to replace my key names, so it will be price here and then quantity right there. And now let's go ahead and see what will happen if I was to call this method and as well as calling the attribute of item.all, because this one stores all the instances inside the list. Now if I was to go ahead and run it, then you can see that I have some errors. Now you see that the errors are related to the price, and you can see that we receive is not greater than or equal to 0. Now let's go ahead and fix this very quickly. So in the items.csv, you can see that those are actually integers that are greater than 0. So the problem is probably the fact that those are passed as strings. So we need to go ahead and pass those as integers. So I'm going to convert those into int like that, and now let's go ahead and see if we will have any problems, as I expect to have any problem because the quantity should complain about the same thing. And you can see that this is exactly what is going on here. So I can use the same for quantity like that and work with that, and you can see that now we see our instances perfectly. Now I want to show one more problem that we could have in the future and we should avoid now. So those three lines are going to work with this structure of a data. But if I was to change the price of our keyboard to something like 74.90, something like that, and re-execute our file, then you can see that we will receive some problems. So we need to convert the price not to an integer but to a float like that. And that is the only way to get over this, because we don't want to convert the price to an integer directly because it could be float. So now we could go ahead and execute, and you can see that now it works perfectly. Although we see the prices as 100.0, but that is something that we will look into it in the future, but for now it works perfect. And now we are ready to jump on to our next topic. Okay, so now that we completely understood class methods, let's go ahead and also understand what static methods are. Now, a static method should do some work for you that has some logical connection to a class. So, for example, if you want to check if a number is an integer or a float, then this is a good candidate for creating a static method, because this has some connection to the class that we work with. So it makes sense to check if a price of an item has a decimal point. And by saying has a decimal point, I obviously count out those that are 0.0. Now, to be honest, static and class methods could look very alike to you, but we will explain the main differences very soon. Okay, so I will use those lines to create our first static method. Now let's go ahead and use the def keyword, and we will name this method is_integer because we said that we'd like to write a static method that will check if a received number is an integer or not. Now if I was to open up and close parentheses, this would obviously receive self. Now I want you to take a closer look. What will happen if I was to change this method into being a static method? And the approach is going to be pretty much the same like we have done with the class method. We will use a decorator that is called static method, and this should be responsible to the conversion. So I will go ahead and use this line. and I will say at static method like that. Now pay attention how the received parameter turned into the regular orange color that we are familiar, because that is just a regular parameter that we receive. Now this means that the static methods are never sending in the background the instance as a first argument, and that is unlike the class methods. The class methods are sending the class reference as a first argument, and that is why we had to receive the CLS, and that is why it is intentionally colored with purple. But with static methods, we never send the object as the first argument. So that is why we should relate to the static method like a regular function that just receives parameters, like we are familiar with isolated functions. Now I will go deeper on this just in a few minutes, but let's go ahead and finish up our static method first. So this should receive num as one parameter, because we should receive at least something to check if it is an integer or not. Alright, so now that we are inside this method, then I can go ahead and use a couple of if statements to check if the received argument is an integer or not. Now if you remember, we said that we will count out the floats that are decimal, that are 0.0, okay? Meaning, for example, 5.0, 10.0, and so on. Alright, so now that we understood this, let's go ahead and use an if statement here. So if, and we will call the built-in function that is called isInstance, and this should receive two arguments. And we can understand what this function is going to do for us. It is going to check if the received parameter is an instance of a float or an integer. So we will pass in as the first argument the num, and as the second argument the float without calling those parentheses. So only the reference to the float keyword. So this conditional should go ahead and check if the num is a floating number or not. Now inside this if statement, I will say return num dot is integer. So by saying dot is integer, then I basically say count out the floats that are decimal, that are 0.0. So this means that if I was to pass in here a number like 10.0, then this will return false. But remember that this will enter here because it thinks it is a float, because it is represented in that way. And so the is underscore integer should check if the point is 0 and should return false accordingly. Now I will also use an else if statement here to basically check if it is integer by itself. So I will say elif is instance num and check if it is an instance of an integer. Then I will just return true, and if it is just something else, then I will just say return false, like that. So now that we have designed this method, then let's take a look how we can call it. So now I will just remove this and this. I'm not actually going to instantiate anything. I'm just going to show you how you can access to the static method. So I will just call this item.isInteger, and I will just pass in a number that I would like to check if it is an integer or not. Now for sure, we like to print this, so we will see the result. Now let's go ahead and pass in 7. So you can see that we receive true. Now if I was to pass in 7.5, then I would receive false. And what is happening in the background? It is the fact that it enters here, but it sees that it is not an integer, so it returns false. But if I was to change this to 7.0, then this should, sorry about that, this should still return true, because what is happening? It is entering inside this conditional, and then it checks if it is an integer, but we said that this method counts out the floats that are 0.0, so it returns true still. So that is a perfect design. Alright, so I have came up with a new file which I will just explain here when to use a class method and when to use a static method, so we can completely understand the differences between those, because I remember myself, I had a very tough time to understand why I need this and why I need the other one. So that will be the main question that I will be answering in this Python file, so don't feel like you have to copy and paste the code, following along what I am explaining here by listening should be enough. Alright, so in this file, I will just go ahead and create this class item that we have. Alright, and I will use pass to not receive errors. Now, when we will use a static method, so we will use a static method when we want to do something that should not be unique per instance, exactly like we have done previously. So isInteger is a method that is just going to be responsible to check if a number is integer or not. So that is why I could allow myself to include this under the item, just like I could use this def as an isolated function right above the class, and that was also okay. But I prefer to not do that because although this is a method that has nothing to do with instance, that is somehow related to the item class. So that is the reason you want to create this as a static method like we have designed previously. And the reason that you would like to create a class method is for instantiating instances from some structured data that you own. So exactly like we have done, we have created a class method that was responsible to read the CSV file and creating some instances. So as I wrote here, those are used to manipulate different structures of data to instantiate objects, like we have done with the CSV file. We could also use a class method like instantiate from a JSON file or from a YAML file. Those just are different ways to maintain data in the best practice way. And that is the code that you look to include inside your class methods. That is why they should be existing in any class, especially if you look to instantiate hundreds of objects on your programs. So it is a great idea to have at least one class method like we have done in the item class. Now, the only main difference between a class method and to a static method is the fact that static methods are not passing the object reference as the first argument in the background. It is noticeable from the fact that we don't have a special highlight, purple in my case, for the first parameter. So if you remember, if I was to go ahead and use here a first parameter like num, then you will see that this is a first parameter that is colored with orange because that is a regular parameter. But that is purple because this is a mandatory parameter that we should receive because what I have just explained. So those are the main differences between a static method to a class method. Now, if you remember, I intentionally said that the class methods and the static methods could only be called from the class level. But however, those also could be called from instances. So as you can see, I can actually instantiate an object and call the isInteger and as well as the instantiate from something. You can just pass in here a number like 5 and I will not receive any errors. And if I was to run the helper, then you can see that I don't have any error. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, I never saw a reason to call a static method or a class method from the instance level. But that is just an option that exists. I know that it is very confusing, but that is something you are rarely going to see. And like I said, I never saw a great reason to call a static method or to call a class method from an instance. So my recommendation to not confuse you is just not going with calling those from the instance level. So I hope you gained some new information from this episode. In the future episodes, we are going to see things like inheritance, and we are going to dive deeper into some of the key concepts that you might have heard of when it comes to object-oriented programming, like inheritance, polymorphism, and abstraction and encapsulation. Those terms are confusing terms that I'm going to simplify by explaining the differences between those so you can totally understand the principles of object-oriented programming. So if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and as well as subscribe to my channel, and I will see you very soon.